Following the disintegration of the Gupta Empire in the middle of the 6th century AD, we find the emergence of many small kingdoms in northern India. One of these was the kingdom of Pushyabhutis of Thanesar. Thanesar, or originally Thaneshwar, is located to the north of Delhi near Kurukshetra. Now, this family becomes quite influential under the reign of Prabhakarvardhan, and it was under his younger son Harshavardhana, who ascended to the throne in 606 AD, that the family becomes a paramount power in northern India. Now, let us have a look at the sources for our study of Harsha's administration. Our first source is a political biography, that is the Harsha Charit, composed by his friend and poet Vanabhatta. A second source is the CUK, that is an account of the travels of the Chinese pilgrim Huensang. Huensang came to India in 627 AD, and his work shows considerable detailed and meticulous observations of events. And this is not surprising given the fact that he was born in a Mandarin family. Archaeological material for Harsha's reign is, however, scarce. There are 3 copperplate inscriptions which record land grants, that is the Madhuban, Banskhera, and the Kurukshetra Varanasi inscriptions. There are also 2 seals, the Nalanda clay seal and the Sonipat copper seal. Some silver coins have been found bearing the epithet Shiladitya, and as we know that Shiladitya was the title taken by Harsha on his accession, these coins can be assigned to him. Besides, a gold coin found from Farrukhabad in UP is definitely of Harsha's reign. Besides, there are also a number of monographs and chapters on Harshavardhan's reign. First of these was published in 1906 by M.L. Etting Hansen. Students can also read the chapters by C.V. Vaidya, R.C. Majumdar, R.K. Mukherjee, as well as K.P. Thaplyal and Shankar Goel.
One very important factor that we have to keep in mind, or we have to discuss during the time of Harshavardhana, what was the administrative framework? We find that his Gupta predecessors had made a fine blend of the system of central control and regional autonomy. That kind of regional autonomy or that kind of central control was not visible in the times of Harshavardhana. Time has really made its changes visible, and the feudo-federal structure of the Gupta times had become much more feudalistic in the times of Harsha. The kind of central authority which the Guptas maintained was perhaps not possible in the times of Harshavardhana, and the imperial framework, therefore, which was exemplified, practiced by the Guptas, somewhat had weakened during the time of Harshavardhan, because his army was not also a monolithic, centrally controlled and centrally recruited army. It was the army, part of which was supplied by his feudal subordinates, and therefore a central command of the army was not possible. And we find that Samantas, or the feudatories, they were also differentiated according to their relationship with the king and according to the various kinds of allegiance which they held to Harshavardhana.
administrative structure of Harsha was highly feudalized. Now, why do we say this? It seems he bestowed the titles of Mahasamanta and Samanta on some of the higher officials of the state, and these kind of titles are also borne by the feudatory rulers, either those who paid tribute to Harsha or those who were subservient to him and then appointed to some suitable government post. Now, it is interesting to see how the term Samanta itself underwent change over time. For instance, in the Arthashastra of Kautilya, it is used in the sense of an independent neighbor, and by the time we come to the Manusmriti or the Yagyavalkya Smriti, it is being used in the sense of those persons with whose help boundary disputes are being resolved. Now, also we learn from Huon Sang that the ministers and higher officials were often paid through land grants instead of cash salaries. That is, pieces of cultivated land were allocated to them and they would enjoy the revenue and other benefits from this land. Now we come to the Central Council of Ministers, that is the Mantri Parishad. Traditionally, the number of ministers in a council is 12, though we do not know the exact number in Harsha's time. But ministers did have an important role in the administration. For instance, Huon Sang again says that after the death of Rajyavardhan, that is Harsha's elder brother, Harsha was unwilling to take up the crown. But it was Po Ni, that is a minister, who persuaded him to do so. Now, this person, Po Ni, has been identified with Bhandi of the Harsha Charit, Bhandi who is a general according to Manabhatta. Also, we know that Po Ni played an important role in the acquisition of the throne of Kannauj for Harsha. Now, it is also interesting to note that the same person could have both the civil as well as military duties or responsibilities. Now, there are references to some other high officials of the central administration, such as the Kumar Amatya. Kumar Amatyas could be stationed either in the provinces or in the districts or even in the central secretariat. Then there is the Mahasandhi Vigrahadikrit. This title refers to the minister, High Minister of Hostilities and Treaties. We also have the reference to other ministers who performed duties like arranging for regular audiences or who looked after the procedures of the court. Besides, there were departments of revenue as well as interstate relations and public welfare. Now, public welfare, in fact, was a very important department during Harsha's time because there were officials who were responsible for the maintenance, and setting up of free lodging, boarding, and medical facilities for the travelers, the poor, as well as the pilgrims. Then they also had to make arrangements for these frequent debates and assemblies which took place. Then Huon Sang refers to an inspector for inspector for Buddhist affairs, and also to certain scribes who were responsible for looking after for the maintenance of state documents and other important papers.
Following the Gupta pattern, Harsha's administrative units were also divided into Bhuktis and Vishayas. The Gupta division of Desa, which was probably for the frontier countries, we do not find that in Harsha's time. The Bhukti was definitely much larger than the Vishaya, and in the inscriptions we come to know a number of bhuktis. For instance, Tira Bhukti, Vardhamana Bhukti, Pundravardhana Bhukti, Ahichatra Bhukti, Nogava Bhukti, Nava Bhukti. These are the various bhuktis that we come across, and there was also perhaps an administrative unit known as Bhoga, and Bhogapati was the head of that administration. There was the Pataka, which was something corresponding to the Pargana, and finally there was a Grama, which is the smallest unit of administration. We also come to know that the Vishaya was autonomous in its administration. The Vishaya had its own courts of law. The Vishaya had these courts of law, very interestingly, some of them were stationary and some of them were moving courts. So we find the essential Gupta characteristic of an autonomous Vishaya was continued even in the days of the Harsha. So thus we can conclude by saying that the central administration did not, or rather could not, interfere in the daily and the regular administration of the Vishaya. So for all practical purposes, they're autonomous, and only from the Vishaya and the Bhukti, there could be appeals to the royal court at the center for judicial cases.
Though we do not have too many details about the sources of revenue, yet we can assume that many of the taxes that were prevalent in the Gupta period were applicable even in Harsha's time. Land revenue was undoubtedly the most important source of income for the state. In the inscriptions, in the land grant inscriptions, we have two terms. One is Udranga, which means the royal share of the produce, and the other term, that is Sarva Raja Kul Bhavya Pratyay, meaning all dues payable to the king. Now, under this term, the following taxes are enlisted. That is, one is Tulame, a tax on merchandise according to weight and measure of the commodity. Second is the Bhag, which is the royal share of the grain, traditionally 1/4 to 1/6 of the produce. There was the Bhog, that is a periodical offering. Then there is Kar, which is a periodical tax. And finally, there is Hiranya. Hiranya, as the name suggests, was a tax paid in cash, or it was levied on cash crops. Now, besides, we find that the state also derived income from trade and commerce, as well as fines levied on various offenders for their crimes. Trade must have been an important consideration for Harsha's campaign against Gujarat, because we know that the coastline of Gujarat has very important seaports having commercial relations with West Asia. And also this same factor must have been come into consideration when he selected Kannauj as his capital over Thanesar, because Kannauj has a nodal position in northern India. Thirdly, he also established diplomatic relations with China, possibly to encourage trade relations.
As in the other departments of administration, in the administration of justice and police duties, we find that Harsha's administration followed the well-defined traditional lines, but we find that there were some innovations also. In the post-Gupta inscriptions, we find the mention of an office known as Pramottaras. Debahuti says that this was perhaps those specialists who interpreted the various legal systems to the king so that the king could function on the advice, and it would help him in the better understanding of the legal procedure that prevailed in the country. Harshavardhana also mentions that the king took the advice of the specialists in the field of judicial administration, because the king was not given much independence, much scope in the promulgation of new laws. He had to act according to the prevailing laws of the land, and definitely he took the advice of the legal proficients, but only when all the prevailing traditions failed, all the interpretations were considered to be inadequate, then only the king could promulgate new laws. And we find that there were a number of officials who helped the king in his disbursement of the judicial and the police duties. In the inscriptions or in Harshavardhana, we find frequent reference to the term danda. This term danda has been used both in military, police and legal connections, but in the Harshavardhana it was in the police connotation, in the use of in the explanation of the police department, in the working of the police department, that the word danda had been used. There is also reference to jails. And this becomes quite evident from the fact that Rajyashree, who was the princess of the Pushyabhuti family and later the queen of Kannauj, she was also put behind the bars. From the Harshavardhana, we come to know that the king was, it was within the powers of the king sometimes to remit the imprisonment, sometimes to issue pardons, but he also here had to function according to the law of the land and according to strict injunctions which were given in the legal, in the Dharma Shastras or the legal procedures of the country. We find that there was imprisonment, there were fines, and there was also amputation of the limbs. For the highest offense of the country was treachery, and for treachery it was life imprisonment, sometimes the amputation of limbs. There was social ostracism, social banning, etc. And these acted as checks against any act of treachery.
And now finally we come to the military organization. The commander-in-chief of the army was the king himself. Bana refers to military posts like Baladhikrit and Senapati. The term Dandanayak appears in several contemporary inscriptions but not in those of Harsha himself. But Huan Sang has given us interesting details about the army. The military service was hereditary in nature, hence the soldiers were very adept in military tactics. The military organization consisted of the infantry, that is the foot soldiers, cavalry, that is the soldiers on horses, elephant corps, as well as the chariots. The soldiers carried various kinds of weaponry such as bows and arrows, sword, saber, spear, as well as the shield. The elephants were covered with a coat of mail and also guarded their tusks with barbed instruments. Besides, we find that there were chariots which were drawn by 4 horses and were guarded by soldiers on either side. And also we find references to Mahanao or large boats in the inscriptions of Harsha, which were situated on the river banks. Surprisingly, Huyen Sang does not mention anything about force. He does, however, give us the figures for the army. Harsha raised the number of foot soldiers from 50,000 to 1 lakh and of elephant corps from 5,000 to 60,000. Now, these figures appear very inflated, but was probably not unlikely if we keep in mind the fact that most of it consisted of feudal levies. That is, many of these soldiers or elephant corps or the cavalry were drawn from the feudatory rulers. And this, in fact, was one of the reasons why the army lacked cohesiveness. There was also a great deal of slackness in discipline. In fact, Banner describes that when the army passed through villages, then the soldiers, in fact, pillaged and destroyed much of the crops and the property of the villagers. Thus, we have had an overview of the administrative organization of Harshavardhan. He built up a vast empire, which he ruled for 41 years, and he also was given the epithet of Sakal Uttarapat Nath, that is, the lord of entire North India, by his Chalukya rival Pulakeshi II. He is known not only for his military exploits but also for his accomplishments in the field of literature. He was himself an erudite scholar. He composed 3 plays, that is the Ratnavali, the Priyadarshika, and the Nagananda. In fact, probably he also composed the text of the 2 copperplate inscriptions, the Banskhera and the Madhuban, which bear his signatures. We should also remember that the great center of learning, Nalanda, was located in his empire, and it is to this university that he also made large grants. However, the edifice that he erected did not last very long. It collapsed right after his death in 647 AD. Though Harsha controlled and influenced large parts of North India, yet he could not provide it with stability or with strength. The reason, again, if we seek, would lie in the feudal nature of his apparatus. The fact that large parts of the empire were in fact only under his indirect control was an important cause. Unlike Samudragupta, who left only the South India, that is, the areas distant from his capital, to tributary rulers, we find that Harshavardhan left even areas close to his capital like Matipur and Mathura to tributary rulers. Secondly, Harsha, we find that most of the time was out of the capital, and these long absences must have affected the administration. His long tours or his military campaigns were also probably undertaken so as to keep a watch on the activities of his feudatories. So therefore, Harshavardhan was once described as the last empire builder of North India by R.K. Mukherjee, but this point of view is now no longer acceptable, as pointed out by Dr. R.C. Majumdar several years ago. In fact, Harshavardhan has been described as a child of his age, an age in which feudalism was very much apparent in the polity, as well as in the economy. And therefore, Harsha may be finally described as an important ruler, but important only in comparison to some of the other monarchs of his time.